filter in at the back. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this beautiful sunny day in Blackpool. The sea fret was just burning off around the Blackpool Tower as I was walking in. It's so nice to be back. For those of us who haven't met, I'm Mark Wallace. I'm the Chief Executive of Conservative Home. You, of course, have joined us for this very special live episode of the Moggcast, kindly sponsored by Thorncliffe, made this event possible. And we are joined by the man himself, Jacob Rees-Mogg. I hope you'll join me in giving him a very warm spring conference welcome. Now, I already know, because several of you have buttonholed me already, that there's lots of questions in the audience, so I promised I won't hog all of Jacob's time myself. We'll come to audience questions as much as possible. But, Jacob, it is part of the introduction to this podcast that says a discussion about the issues of the day. So, can I start with the first one, which is Blackpool itself? Here we are, we're back for a Conservative Party conference in Blackpool. Do you like to be by the seaside?
I do, beside the sea, where the brass band plays tiddly-um-pum-pum, beside the seaside, beside the sea. It's lovely to be back, and I think it is a sensible rebalancing. That, it's been very nice having party conferences in Manchester and Birmingham, but our historic seaside homes have something special about them, and I think they're more welcoming in a way for members. They're probably less expensive than city centres, and in a city centre, in a way, a party conference can get lost, whereas by the seaside, we are, for the time we're here, the main event, and it becomes a wonderful community activity. But I think it's also part of levelling up. Levelling up isn't just about the big urban centres, it's about the seaside towns, it's about the whole of the country.
And in that sense, as you say, it kind of reflects, there's been some of this political shift we've seen in recent years, the towns agenda, coastal communities. Would you like to see the main party conference back in Blackpool or Bournemouth or Brighton?
Well, I always loved going to Bournemouth. I'm slightly biased because Bournemouth isn't too far from where I live in Somerset, so it was by far and away the easiest drive to get there. But Brighton we had a problem with, you may remember, which is why we stopped going to Brighton. But yes, I think variety. I'm not saying we shouldn't go to Birmingham, Manchester, because I've enjoyed the conferences there, but I think variety is good. Whether we can go back to Llandudno, I'm not entirely sure. It may not be big enough for a party conference anymore, but I think it'd be great to have a party conference outside England.
And part of that element that you mentioned is the influence of history. I suppose we're here in the Winter Gardens. We're in the new extension to the Winter Gardens, this fantastic kind of modern conferencing facility, but we're also in the same building where so many of those great speeches, not just to Conservative conferences, but to TUC Congress in the past, great speeches of formative political history in Britain.
Well, this is an outbreak of left-wingery, isn't it, from the Chief Executive of Conservative Home saying great TUC conferences. I'm not sure I'm going that far. But certainly, I mean, this perhaps dates me a bit, but the party conference when Harold Macmillan was about to go, and all the jockeying for position that was going on, Lord Hailsham going for a swim in the sea to show how hale and hearty he was, something that's been imitated recently by politicians going swimming in the Serpentine. It's quite interesting how history repeats itself.
Have you brought your trunks?
Definitely not, no. And anyway, surely I would have to go swimming in one of those rather splendid Edwardian costumes.
That was exactly what I had in mind, so I'm very sorry to hear you've left it home, possibly with one of those bathing things on wheels that goes down.
Like George III had. You should all read Andrew Roberts' brilliant book on George III, because it has a picture of George III's bathing machine, which lasted for a long time, I think into the early 20th century. And they didn't believe in swimming. They just went into the water and took the water. They didn't drink the beastly stuff, but it was a bit salty. But they just went into it in proper bathing costumes.
And on the kind of history-related theme, one of the conversations I was having with the Conservative Home team over dinner last night was the way in which the events of your younger years could be so formative on your own politics. We're thinking, obviously, wondering what life is going to be like and what the future view of the world is going to be like for young people looking at what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. I was particularly horrified to find that William Atkinson, our latest editorial team member, was one when the Twin Towers were destroyed on September the 11th. For me, I was just saying my early memories include the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, and then Yugoslavia and Chechnya and so on was very formative on my view of the world. What were your early kind of formative memories from the political world?
Well, the great battle of the late 70s and early 80s was over nuclear disarmament. And the Conservative Party was very clear that we had to face up to this major threat from Russia, from the Soviet Union, and that to face it properly we had to be fully armed. But there were huge marches against nuclear weapons. There was the power of CND. The whole Labour Party by 1983 became committed to nuclear disarmament. And that was fundamental, I think, to understanding the power of conservatism, the practicality of conservatism, the realization that the world is as it is, not as you would want it to be. And the nuclear disarmers were all thinking the world was as they would want it to be rather than as it really is. And that's a very important lesson, I think, for all politics.
And how would you anticipate, it's inevitably hard to predict, but how would you anticipate the impact of what we're seeing in Ukraine on, say, the worldview and the politics of a young person in the United Kingdom? What do you think it would reinforce, or what it might challenge?
Well, first of all, it's a reminder that there is genuine evil in the world and that Putin is an evil man. And we mustn't get away from that. We mustn't try and pretend this is just the natural expression of Russian patriotism. It isn't. It is a single evil figure who is leading this. So it is a reminder of the power of individuals in the making of history. So you may not agree with the great man theory of history, but I think it's fundamentally important. The leaders make a difference, and that's whether they're men or women, as Margaret Thatcher did hugely for the good in this country. But it's also a reminder that the world is serious, and that there are serious things to be discussed and serious and difficult decisions for politicians to take. And whether this is about reopening and having new licenses for oil wells in the North Sea, or whether it is about getting away from the wokery that has beset huge sections of society. Nobody now cares whether using the word, whatever it was, grip, is going to offend people, do they? I don't suppose any of you do. I certainly don't, because all that nonsense is shown for the trivial nature of it, and that we are now looking at serious, difficult decisions having been made. I mean, I'd say the same Partygate, that all of that is shown up for the disproportionate fluff of politics that it was, rather than something of fundamental seriousness about the safety of the world and about the established global order. And this, I think, resets politics in a fundamental way, because we are now thinking, and COVID was part of this too, how do we deal with the difficult choices that need to be made with limited budgets, but many pressing reasons for spending money, with an economy that is being hit by increases in prices that we haven't had to worry about. We've had pretty low commodity prices for the last 10 years. Suddenly that's changing. Suddenly there's a cost of living crisis, supply chain difficulties that come from the after effects of COVID. And so politics has been recalibrated with a new seriousness, in my view.
There are two elements of that I'd like to take a little bit more of a detailed look at, I suppose. Is it definitely true that this is going to banish the kind of fripperies that obsessed our politics? I'm going to make a rare confession for a journalist. Early on in the pandemic, I wrote an article saying now we can see that this obsession with finding offence that doesn't exist, the emphasising feelings over facts and so on, is going to be swept away. Now you see when something really serious happens that affects literally a life or death issue, huge challenges to the economy, massive impositions on the capabilities of the state and on personal freedom and so on. I'm not sure, looking at some of the events, seeing Kathleen Stock still being hounded for what 10 years ago would have seemed like pretty normal mainstream things to say. I'm not sure I was proved right on that. Is it really the case that this is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back of this nonsense, or is it perhaps more persistent than we give it credit?
Well, I think we have a job to do as Conservatives. I think language is important, and as Conservatives we've brought in over the last 20 years to socialist language, and that is a terrible mistake. We shouldn't do that. we should definitely say chairman rather than chairperson. We shouldn't allow the beginnings of woke language to feed in, because then you begin to accept their argument. I'm not at all convinced that we should call Peking Beijing, because I think that is sucking up to a totalitarian regime. That we should stick, I still think we should call Leghorn, but that may be a bit obscure because nobody any longer knows where Leghorn is. Livorno, for the record. But I think we should be robust about how we use language, because that's actually what most people are willing to do until they're persuaded that it's no longer politically acceptable. And if we just cede the ground, then wokery advances. But when serious things happen and wokery is in retreat, we should make it clear. We should make these arguments, say, look, who wants to worry about this now? And so I get your point about you would have thought COVID would have brought it to an end. I think the Ukraine is even more serious than COVID. And I think that COVID has perhaps brought back the seriousness which Ukraine is now confirming.
That can work in the opposite direction, can't it? In some ways, it could be perhaps an unwoke thing when one thinks, for example, about the Ukrainians talking about whether they prefer Kiev or Kiev, not the BBC's Kyiv, which seems to be to be invented, or indeed when Ukrainians say they would prefer not to be referred to as the Ukraine. Is that something we ought to defer to on the basis of their position? It's about their nationhood or not?
I'm on their side, so I've dropped the definite article from Ukraine. I always said the Ukraine and the Sudan and various other places, but look, I'm on the side of Ukraine, so if they want me to call it Ukraine, absolutely, happy to do that, because we are showing our political support. Language is important, and we want to show our political support for the incredible bravery of the people of Ukraine.
Presumably, where do you stand on Sainsbury's rebranding chicken Kievs?
Well, as I think it was developed in America rather than in Ukraine anyway, and it's not a dish I would eat. Hasn't it got garlic in it or something nasty like that? Very dangerous stuff, garlic, I've always thought. So as I'm not going to eat it, I'm not particularly worried what you call it.
Fair enough. Neutrality on the point of
absolutely right, on this major topic of our time, yes.
The second issue I was going to look at, just briefly, from when we were talking about the category of kind of fripperies which we now see don't matter, is this question of Partygate. So I wonder, I confess at times for me, watching some of the public reaction to this topic, and I confess sometimes looking at the political management of the topic, it's given me some very uncomfortable reminders of the MP's expenses era in terms of the feeling of frustration on the part of voters about the idea of one rule for you, one rule for me. And is Partygate a frippery, or is it something that gets to the question of abiding by rules one sets for others?
I mean, I think it's actually very like the Westland affair, that it is something that absolutely obsessed Whitehall and Westminster, because it was very much a process issue about how government was being carried out. And I think it's one of those things like Westland that became an enormous focus for a very brief time. But I think when we look back, how long ago is Westland now? It's 36 years ago. When we look back in 36 years at Partygate, people will think, what were they on about? Why were they doing that when they were passing from COVID and dealing with that to Russia and Ukraine? I was about to say the Ukraine. I corrected myself as I was speaking. And yet they were distracted by whether or not the Prime Minister spent 5 minutes in his own garden, or 25 minutes, or whatever it is. But you see, one quickly can't remember the precise amounts of times because it is fundamentally trivial.
In terms of what it would look like from your perspective for these people to recalibrate what they think is important, obviously there's the rights and wrongs of a topic, and then, because this is politics, there's also the political impact of a topic, which is not always the same thing. We've seen the party's recovery in the opinion polls in recent weeks. Is there, what do you think is underlying that? Because is it concrete and lasting, or is there a risk that when one has, say, a poll bounce or during a pandemic or during a war, that to a certain extent one's at the mercy of events that by definition you don't control, and it will end?
we are all obsessed, or everyone in this room is obsessed by opinion polls. We all love them, don't we? And watch them and look at them, and we look very carefully at how they're reported on Conservative Home. But they are a particular, as Lord Ashcroft keeps on pointing out, a particular snapshot. Just think of all those opinion polls between 1979 and 1987. How many of them would have indicated that Margaret Thatcher was going to keep on winning large majorities? Most of the time, only the poll a few weeks before the general election took place. And why was that? Well, all sorts of reasons. Partly, people want to say the nice thing to say, the fashionable thing to say. If you're a shy Tory, why on earth do you say it 2 years from an election? You keep it quiet. Partly because people respond to the immediate reaction. I mean, Westminster City Council put in 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. And this made me think, how annoying. It didn't make me think I wasn't going to vote Conservative in Westminster City Council elections, but it irritated me. Don't like 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. I think they're broadly, well, they're Lib Dem. Isn't that a rude enough thing to say about them? And so even the staunchest Conservative thinks things are happening that he or she does not wish to see happen. And in midterm, that's the opportunity to say to an opinion pollster, I'm a bit fed up with this, I'm not voting Conservative. Then when you're faced with the choice of who would be Prime Minister, you think very differently. So I can't, the old line politicians use is we don't look at opinion polls just isn't true. We all look at them obsessively. But actually, the midterm opinion polls are not good predictors normally of what is going to happen at the general election. There is an exception, and that is post Black Wednesday in 1992, and a couple of months after that, we fall massively behind on every rating, particularly on economic management in the polls, and we never recover, and we get to 1997, and we have the result that we all remember. But that actually is the exception rather than the rule.
The other thing that politicians like to say, particularly when the polls are bad, is there's only one poll that matters, and that's on election day.
I carefully avoided that cliché.
I've gone straight for it, you'll be pleased to hear. Which brings us to the fact that we're now, we're at the latter stages of midterm, really, and this government's been very unfortunate in having had a huge amount of time, understandably hijacked by the pandemic. We now have, people keep saying a land war in Europe, Putin's next land war in Europe, from my perspective, after his invasion of Ukraine in 2014. This obviously is now setting the agenda again, seizing a huge amount of the government's attention and bandwidth, has another further economic impact. We're getting quite close to the point at which the next election campaign will start. And it seems to me that Ben Houchen, the great model for kind of insurgent conservative electoral success, has been founded very solidly on material, visible, measurable, real changes to people's lives. Not going into election, for example, promising that we will do something, but being able to go into election saying, look around you, can you not see how the world has changed as a result of your vote in 2019? What are the things that the government can still do before the next election, whenever it may be, to give people that feeling, to underscore that message when the Prime Minister stands up at the next election and makes his pitch?
Okay. We're not as far through midterm as you think. I mean, the Quinquennial Act gives us, and I think the Fixed Term Parliament Act is going to get royal assent next week. So we're back to a proper constitutional system. It's a beautiful act of Parliament because it restores the prerogative which people told you was impossible. And nothing is impossible in legislative terms. If you say the prerogative is restored, and it's great. And it's one of my favourite acts of Parliament because I always thought the Fixed Term Parliament Act was a piece of constitutional vandalism that failed to understand how a constitution worked. So we've got theoretically until December 2024. So that's still more than 2.5 years away. We're not yet halfway through, though this is not a promise, just to cheer you all up, because you're the ones who'll do all the hard work for the election, that we're going to have another December election. I hope we avoid that, because that was quite hard work for Conservative volunteers.
Exclusive, an early election before
I
December.
think December is unlikely, but the decision won't be made by me. But what can we do that is concrete? Well, I think we've done some pretty concrete things, actually, because politics isn't about dealing with the things that you would like to do. It is about dealing with the things that you are faced with. and seeing if you are competent at dealing with them. So when you think about the COVID crisis, the Prime Minister, to my mind, got all the big decisions right throughout the crisis. Again and again and again, he got the big decisions right. And they were very much his decisions. It was very much led by him.
Even lockdown timings on each occasion?
Even lockdown timings. Now, you may have seen gossip that I wasn't the most enthusiastic locker-downer of people. But I think with the information the Prime Minister was being given, when he made lockdown decisions, he made them reluctantly. But he made them at a point when they went with the grain of what the public wanted and expected. And you have to go with the grain of what the public want in these circumstances. But he got the vaccine right. He got the unlocking down in summer of last year right, when everyone was telling him, all the boffins were saying, "Oh dear, that's a bit nerve-wracking, wouldn't do that." Christmas, when he was being told it was extremely unwise to do it. And the socialists in Wales locked down, and the nationalists in Scotland, they're still wearing masks in Scotland, aren't they? I could make a rude comment, but I won't.
Please do.
No, I'm not going to. No, I'm not going to. I'm going to be restrained. They get very upset if you tease Mrs. Sturgeon, so I won't dream of doing any such thing. She's always a very happy, jolly person, I think. And he got it right. And I think people see that and they recognise that. And that's before we get on to the vaccine, which was the most stunning success and showed the British state at its best. And it's a bit like Barnes Wallis and the Bouncing Bomb, and we all remember the Dam Busters film, that it is when the British state really wants to do something enterprising and effectively, and all the levers of power are pulled to make it happen, we can do really amazing things, but it always requires the Prime Minister to make that decision and give that push, which he did.
So does that mean that the message come the next election could end up being, well, you know, we were talking about all these priorities in 2019. We always had to get Brexit done, as has happened. But there was also a great weight of expectation about transformation. Various Westminster terms, I think, have been too patronising on things like this, the left-behind communities, or all of those kind of terms. But the transformation of life for people who took a chance, often for the first time in their lives, to vote Conservative, is the message going to be, well, other stuff's happened in between, but we dealt with that well?
Well, inevitably that's going to be part of the message, but things are happening. The 14 new hospitals are being built. This is something that people are seeing in their communities. The extra police are being taken on. So we are doing things. We're using our Brexit freedoms, and we're going to be about to use them a great deal more. In the next session of Parliament, we're going to have a number of pieces of legislation that put into legal practice the benefits that we get from no longer being in the EU. So I think we will go to the voters saying, look, we've done X, Y, and Z in difficult circumstances because of the events you know about, but we also handled those difficult events as well as anybody could have done. And I think that is a very good prospectus to put before the British people.
Evidently, like a lumbering prize fighter, I've signalled accidentally my next blow, which is going to be about the question of Brexit opportunities. Obviously, this is now your ministerial role, Brexit opportunities and government efficiency. I think that's correct. Right, yes, there we go. Obviously, Brexit opportunity has to be a major part of that. What, from your point of view, what are the top priorities to seize Brexit opportunities? What difference will they make, and how rapidly can we capitalise on them?
We can capitalise on them at the pace at which we want to capitalise on them. We are now in charge. What are the opportunities? Well, I think the opportunities are absolutely essential to how we deal with the cost of living crisis, because the only way to deal with the cost of living crisis is through supply-side reforms that will make the economy more efficient and cheaper. And what are those? They're removing non-tariff barriers on trade, making it easier for goods to come into this country. I've got in my pocket, I've been carrying this around for ages. A constituent of mine is an egg producer. And he...
A chicken?
An egg producer. He's not a...
I'm sorry.
Not a chicken. I think he's come on the wrong stage. He's meant to be on a comedy show later. And he imported the boxes to put his eggs in and got a Brexit import declaration charge of £55. importing from the EU. This is a self-imposed charge. Why are we making lives harder for people? We didn't need to do that. So the first thing we've got to do is recognise we are not the European Union. We don't need to replicate the European Union's ridiculous schemes against our own people importing things. We need to make all of that easier. Non-tariff barriers we need to push down. And this is where free trade agreements are helpful, but we need to go further. We need to get back to common law principles of regulation. So there will be a financial services bill, which is ready to go in the next session of Parliament, that will go back to a principles-based system of financial services regulation. We've already announced the changes to Solvency II, which I've actually been interested in since I was on the Treasury Select Committee under Andrew Tyre's chairmanship before the 2015 election. Solvency II was, as far as I could tell, an attempt by the EU to hamper the London insurance market. We're going to get rid of that, freeing up billions of pounds for investment in the UK economy in a way, and making more competition in the insurance market. So these are really big things that happen. They're going to involve huge amounts of money. We've got the regulation on gene editing of plants through. Did you see about the peer who fell asleep last week and got told off? Wasn't that amazing, forceful ticking off in a very sort of headmistressly way when he was told he wasn't allowed to speak? Oh, that was splendid. And it's one of the virtues of the House of Lords being a self-governing house, that you can be shamed out of speaking if you've been snoring away. Anyway, that was on the gene editing regulation. And it's allowing us to do things that the EU stopped and that allow economic growth and allow us to be more efficient. And yes, there's lots more to do. It's why I asked Sun and Sunday Express readers to let me know their ideas, because part of it's going to be really big things like Solvency II. Part of it's going to be little things, little annoyances in your lives that are an unnecessary regulation. And I don't really mind whether it's an EU regulation or it's a self-imposed regulation. If we don't have the supply-side reforms, we are facing being a slow-growth, high-cost economy. And that will not deliver any of the things that the government is promising, to go back to your earlier question.
Does that represent a kind of reversion by the government to some of the earlier ways in which Brexit was often described, when we were talking about becoming an energetic competitor to the EU, so something people sometimes describe as kind of Singapore in the North Sea or similar? And is that potentially a challenge in terms of how the EU themselves might react? We obviously have ongoing discussions with them. We still see some various tensions over the Northern Ireland Protocol and so on. The EU has always reacted, I think, for imaginable reasons, in a pretty hostile way to the idea of kind of deregulating, more competitive modern economy just off their shore. Is that something which involves the government kind of going back on its words in any way in terms of things that have been said to Brussels?
No, I don't think so. I don't think we said to Brussels that we would follow their rules and make ourselves as uncompetitive as they are. I don't remember any promise of that kind being given to the burghers of Brussels.
And in terms of promises that are being given domestically in the UK, we've heard various promises, I think, about there will be no watering down of environmental regulation, there will be no reduction in food standards below, in vague terms, below the EU's standard of food quality. Are those things hostages to fortune that you now have to dance through?
No, what do you mean by lowering food standards? I mean, who thinks when they go to America that the food's all rubbish? It's not. It's excellent. And it's very high quality, and it's the most litigious country in the world, so its food is to a very high standard. The EU has process standards rather than result standards. And getting away from process standards to result or outcome standards is obviously what you should be doing. What you care about is whether your steak is fresh, tastes nice, and doesn't have germs in it. You don't care about whether, unless you want Kobe beef, the cow has been massaged with beer to make it more flavoursome, and that's why Kobe beef is, I believe, I'm not an expert on Kobe beef, what it's worth, tastes so splendid. Frankly, when I had it, I couldn't tell the difference between good Somerset beef. So I think we've got to look at outcomes, not processes, and EU regulation is process-based. So of course I'm in favour of high standards. Of course, I'm in favour of high animal welfare standards, actually where we've tended to have higher standards than the EU anyway. So I don't think we undermine what we have said by going to outcomes rather than to processes.
Some have said during the course of the last couple of weeks in particular, on questions like sanctions, but also on watching, say, the EU belatedly pull itself together in terms of its attitudes on Ukraine. Some have said that this changes the calculation in terms of our independence and our regaining of control from the European Union. I think there have been various suggestions in terms of the UK sanctions regime might be structured in such a way as to be able to echo or kind of copy across some EU sanctions. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think what has happened over the last few weeks has shown the great advantage of having left the European Union. I'm not sure we would have, under the doctrine of sincere cooperation, been able to deliver arms to Ukraine if we had still been a member of the European Union. Now, I'm not stating that absolutely authoritatively, but sincere cooperation meant that we had to operate within the confines of the common defence and foreign and security policy. And that was very divided within the EU, as we know. But because we were outside, we were able to go way ahead of what other countries were doing and encourage them. And the Prime Minister, again, did this absolutely brilliantly. He persuaded other countries to move in the same direction as the UK. He was instrumental in getting the US to move in the right direction, and the EU. If we'd been tied in to the EU's High Representative and all the structures of the EU, it's highly improbable that we would have been able to do this.
Thank you. Now, we are halfway through, so one more question from me before we move to what I know will be many from the audience. Again, on ending where I started, on the issues of the day, obviously we've seen the news this week about P&O and the job losses and protests that are now starting there. Some of that, looking at some of the, say, Labour reaction to that, some of it has been to draw in discussions of things like employment standards and protections, but also this vexed question of fire and rehire. I looked on Twitter briefly this morning, which is not the same thing as looking at Britain as a whole. Yeah. I see you getting some flack about that in terms of your past comments on fire and rehire. What's your perspective on that story?
Well, I think P&O has behaved very badly. Have you seen the little video? That is not the way to treat people. Look, I am a capitalist. I believe in free markets, but I believe in people behaving properly. And P&O has not behaved properly to the people it employed, some of whom have worked for it for many years. And that, I believe in labour markets that are flexible. I think that leads to higher employment. But I also believe that employers have duties, and they have duties to behave well and properly and considerately to their employees. And I think P&O failed in that. And P&O should be very well aware that this failure has consequences, because it is much harder to defend free markets when people abuse the freedoms that they have. So I think what P&O has done is very damaging, very foolish, and improper to the people that it used to employ. I'm not a great one of all this video conferencing anyway. I mean, I think it has a useful purpose. But actually, firing somebody needs to be done in person and not by a mass broadcast. I thought that broadcast was awful. It was rude, it was arrogant, and it was unpleasant. And I think that P&O ought to be very careful in behaving this way, because it risks undermining capitalism and free markets that are so essential to our prosperity.
Thank you. Well, we've covered an awful lot there, from bathing suits to the...
and garlic.
And garlic, indeed, and to high matters of international affairs. Now, I know there'll be lots of people in the audience with questions. I should say, as always, the Conservative Home ground rules apply, which is, first, please wait for the microphone to reach you. Secondly, please say who you are and ideally where you're from. And thirdly, it must be a question. If it's a speech, I will boo you until you sit back down. So this has been my standing policy for many years. So let's start with a question in the front row here.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
I do.
Okay. My name is Ruben. I'm from Germany. And I want to ask you, you said before that you believe that the supply chain problems are responsible for inflation. But to which extent do you believe that the demand side, when you look at governmental spending and how the central bank is monetizing the debt, is responsible also for inflation? And do you believe that there's a way to fix it by tightening monetary policy without that the economy is going into recession?
And could you pass the microphone just behind you? We'll take a second question at the same time.
Josephine, I'm from Brighton, Kent Town. Defence. We've been looking in the last year or so, reducing the size of the army, getting rid of the additional Typhoon squadrons. With what's happening in UK, do you think we need to look again at defence? And with the EU looking at increasing defence spending, should we be looking at cooperating more with European defence production rather than increasingly buying from the United States?
Two light topics there.
Yeah, okay, well, I might answer the second one first and then comes the first one. On defence, the EU increasing its expenditure is catching up because we have met the NATO commitment, as have some of the frontline NATO states, but most of the EU member states of NATO have not met the 2% commitment. So they have some catching up to do, and that doesn't necessarily mean we need to go any further. We always have to make sure that the money we spend on defence is spent well and that our procurement is efficient as possible. And there is a brilliant procurement minister at the moment, Jeremy Quinn, who is ensuring that that is happening. So I think we can be encouraged by that. I think the reality is, in terms of how our equipment is purchased and works, that the US has the best technology and that they are the most powerful defence nation in the world. And if they will give us access to their defence equipment, then that's where we want to be going. It's simply extraordinarily good, and that it is inconceivable we would be involved in any major action without being joint with the United States, and therefore interoperability with the United States is fundamental. So no, I wouldn't skew it for political reasons to another country or a region. To come on to the economy, is inflation a monetary phenomenon? Yes, of course it is. And if you endlessly print money, that will have an inflationary effect. And there have been some sharp increases in money supply over the last couple of years, and they will be part of the reason for the problem. The difficulty is, in a way, in terms of monetary policy, that nobody thought to fix the roof when the sun was shining. And therefore, we had very little room for manoeuvre other than quantitative easing 2 years ago. There was very little room to cut interest rates, because when the economies were growing from the sort of mid-20 teens, interest rates weren't put up and quantitative easing wasn't reduced. And that's not particularly in the UK. This isn't particularly a criticism of the Bank of England. It wasn't happening in the US, which leads monetary policy globally. There's, in a way, not... If the US is setting monetary policy in one direction, the UK can't particularly go off in another direction without some quite important consequences. Bank of England is now tightening monetary policy. But this is quite difficult because what matters to people paying mortgages is not the absolute interest rate level, but the increase in the payments that they have to make. So if their interest rate is going up from 1% to 1.25%, that's a 25% increase in their payments. That is the same, thinking back to the 1980s, of interest rates going up from 10% to 12.5%. So it becomes, small increases nominally have a very geared effect on household disposable income after housing costs. So it's very difficult to tighten monetary policy without severe economic consequences. So this is, I imagine, why the Bank of England is doing it in a gradualist way, but recognises that inflation is, at least in part, a monetary consequence. It's been exacerbated and brought to the fore by supply-side issues, by the supply chain becoming completely disjointed during COVID and taking longer to get back to normal than one might have hoped for. But ought really to have expected, because actually the international supply chain is very complex. And it's then, of course, been made worse by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because of the supply of commodities from Ukraine, and then the sanctioning of Russian oil. So that's made the situation worse. But yes, there is a monetary element, and yes, the central banks are now beginning to tackle that.
Now let's take, let me see, two questions here, the gentleman on the end of the front row and the lady in the blue jacket. No, I promise we'll get the microphone towards the back of the room shortly.
Hi, my name is William. Nice to see you again in Blackpool. I just have a quick question about Ukraine. And do you think that China will involve or support Russia, or maybe they just take advantage to invade Taiwan? And if they do either of them, so what would the UK and the West would respond to this? Thank you.
And if you just pass the microphone along to the lady. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Jenny Johnson from Wirral West. How important do you think it is for us to enable to have the narrative and the counter-narrative situations? We've banned Russia Today, for instance. Don't you think it's important for us to hear the counter-narrative rather than sticking to one narrative? Thank you.
Jacob.
Russia Today hasn't been banned by the government, it's been banned by Ofcom, and I think that's important. I'm very tempted by what you say, because during the Second World War, people tuned into Lord Haw and laughed at him. And sometimes hearing the other side's argument makes you realise how ridiculous it is and reinforces what you are hearing from other sources. So I'm always nervous about banning things, and I'm very glad it didn't become a matter of government policy. I think freedom of speech is of fundamental importance. And freedom of speech means allowing people to say things you don't like. It's no good having freedom of speech which just allows people to agree with me. I mean, that'd be marvellous, wouldn't it? But assuming we're not allowed to live in that sort of a world, you have to allow people to say things you disapprove of. I mean, I do slightly wonder about some of our broadcasting regulations, because you will be aware that there is an obligation for impartiality. Now, how well is that enforced? I mean, I'm not for banning the BBC, but I wonder whether America gets it better. I love the First Amendment. I think it is a great amendment, and it puts freedom of speech ahead of everything else. Dominic Raab was brilliant yesterday on not allowing the oligarchs to use our courts to crush freedom of speech. In America, they couldn't crush freedom of speech because of the First Amendment. And I think that's a very good system to have. We've got now the court-created privacy laws that crush freedom of speech. And this seems to me to be quite wrong, that if Parliament wanted privacy laws, it would have passed them specifically, not have them developed over the last 20 years or so since the Human Rights Act came in, as the judges try and weigh up priorities. And that's been a mistake. I think we should go to much, much clearer rights of freedom of speech, because it keeps politicians on their toes, it develops interesting thinking, and it gives you confidence in the news that you are hearing, because you can compare the fish and the fowl, particularly fowl when coming from Russia. Sorry, that was a terrible joke. So terrible that even a good Conservative Home audience didn't laugh. I'm not sure even my children would have laughed at that particularly awful joke. Anyway, China. We know that Presidents Biden and Xi are going to be meeting, I think, later on today. I have been relieved, actually, by the approach China has taken so far. It has not supported Russia. I think abstention in the UN Security Council was as much as you could possibly have hoped for, and that is positive and encouraging. Taiwan is rightly, strongly protected by the United States, has a great deal of support from the US Congress, and has done for many years. And the fundamentals of the rule of international law are based on the idea that states cannot go around willy-nilly invading each other. And that once they do, you make a mockery of any international order. So I hope and assume that Taiwan will not be invaded by China. I don't particularly want to set hairs running. I understand the position of the Chinese government that Taiwan is an integral part of Taiwan. It used to be the case that Taiwan thought the rest of China was an integral part of Taiwan. And that was why we used to recognize the Taiwanese government, the Republic of China, rather than the People's Republic of China. That is a dispute between the two of them that can be resolved between the two of them, but it should not involve force.
Thank you. Now I see two questions standing at the back there.
Sam Coates from Sky. Jacob Rees-Mogg, when the cabinet that you're part of decided to raise national insurance back last September, we were in a completely different political universe. Today, the cost of living pressures are so much greater, in part because of what's going on in Ukraine. I just wanted to invite you really to remake the case for that national insurance rise, which is about to come in and convince everybody in this room why it's such a good idea. And given that we are told quite a lot that you are part of a tax-cutting government, is reversing the national insurance rise top of the list of things that you would do if there was spare change towards the end of the Parliament?
Thank you. And I think we have another question, just a few people along.
Hello, Michael Caswell from Lincolnshire. You can write a book or a poem, you can write a song or a tune, and your copyright lasts about 70 years. You invent a spoon by way of an object, and you have to re-register it. And in short, it is insane because it will only last about 20 years, but you have to register it every year for that 20 years. But if we made the patent laws such that they were the same as the tune, song, or whatever, that would bring revenue to Great Britain, which holds a huge history of invention.
Thank you very much. Minister.
I wouldn't do that, because if you made patents last for as long as copyright, you would freeze development and innovation. That patents very often build on what has previously been done before. If you think of the drug industry, the generic industry is a very important next stage of the drug industry. And patents are essentially the grant of a monopoly for a set period. And they are granted to pay for the costs of development, but they are not there to allow a supernormal profit to be made indefinitely. And so I think the balance on patents is about right, and that we would cause economic damage if we so restricted markets by allowing patents to last for 75 years. And in the case of copyright, of course, it's 75 years from the death of the person who owns the copyright, if it's held individually. That is an exceptionally long time. But that's because what is being copyrighted is a different kind from an invention. It is drawn from the individual and doesn't necessarily have any further economic development. That is to say, if you take P.G. Wodehouse, a great author to take, that what he did was use his own imagination to entertain people. And of course, other writers can be pastiches of P.G. Wodehouse, as long as they don't use the same characters. But P.G. Wodehouse doesn't lead to a new form of widget. It may allow people to write a new book to which they would have copyright, but it's just different from the evolution of a product, which may then be incorporated in another product, and you don't want it to be restricted on a permanent basis. To come to national insurance, as you would expect me to say, this is a matter for the Chancellor. And the Chancellor will be making a statement. I believe he's speaking here very soon, and he will then be making the spring statement, I believe, next week. The Conservative Party is a party of low taxation. I believe the chairman of the Conservative Party said yesterday that we were at the maximum level of taxation that we could manage. And I think that's right. I think if you look at tax as a percentage of GDP, we are at an abnormally high level, which is not surprising considering the experiences that we've gone through in the last couple of years. But the Conservatives need to get back to being a tax-cutting government. And that's why I pay such importance to the supply-side reforms. Because what we need to do is grow the economy. And if we can grow the economy, then there will be the room for tax cuts. We also need government efficiency because we need to work out what the government should not be doing or what it does that it does expensively. I mean, in my previous role as Leader of the House, I wasn't the greatest advocate of restoration and renewal. Why? Because I didn't think it was going to be a prudent use of taxpayers' money to spend £14 billion Disneyfying the Palace of Westminster. So we've got to be serious about where we spend money. We've got to look at the supply-side reforms. And then you can direct your questions, as you knew I was going to say, to my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
We have a few more minutes. Let me see, the lady here and the gentleman on the aisle there.
Thank you. I think many Conservatives, would like to think that we all respected and cared for our elderly. Now, at a time of very high inflation, how come we've accepted from our government that they have broken a manifesto promise and suspended the triple lock on pensions? We already have one of the lowest pensions in Europe. I think, my opinion, we should be looking after our elderly. They worked hard and contributed for a very long time. And as a Conservative, I feel ashamed.
And just for the record, you're from Richmond Park.
Oh, sorry, Susie Webb from Richmond Park, yes.
And second question here.
Oh, good morning, sir. Andy Shannon from Ipswich. Just a quick question. Robert Halfon, the MP, is trying to get the tax on the fuel card. What's your opinion on that? And if the Conservatives did cut the tax, do you think it would do good for the party?
Robert Halfon is a great man and one of the most effective campaigners in the House of Commons, and it's really through his efforts that fuel duty hasn't increased since the Conservatives have been in government in 2010. He is very good at understanding what his voters need and want and campaigning for it effectively. However, there is always a tension in any government's approach to tax and spend, and that is we need to raise the revenue to pay for the things that we need to pay for, and it has to come from somewhere. So I think what he is asking for is difficult, but there is an obvious question to raise over fuel taxation, which is that it always exaggerates the direction of travel because you add VAT on top of the price. So when prices are falling, the VAT take declines, and when prices are rising, the VAT rate increases prices by a further 20% because VAT is paid on fuel duty as well as on the underlying price of the fuel. What I would like to do, I'd like to do what the Americans do. They do it with fuel, but they do it with so many things, is that the price is advertised as what it is pre-tax, and then when you go in and pay for it, you get told this is the tax on top. And I think this would be revolutionary. I think people would suddenly think, good heavens, I'm paying an enormous amount of tax, whereas the current system of having the full price advertised means that people don't realise quite how much is being taken. But I think, as on all tax matters, I'd better refer it to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. To come to the triple lock, no, I'm sorry, I don't agree. And the reason I don't agree is that average earnings became extremely volatile during the pandemic. So in the previous year, we had to adjust the law because actually the law as it stood in 2020 would not have allowed us to give any increase in pension at all because average earnings actually fell. And so the law was amended to allow for the rise in pensions that year, even against a background of falling earnings. Now then you had a natural catch-up in earnings because If earnings go down by, let's make the maths easy, by 20%, the following year, to get back to zero, they have to go up by 25%. So if you said that the 20% was a freeze, but you got the 25%, you would have a massive increase in pension when in fact earnings were flat. And that was what was underlying the reasoning for not going with earnings last year, because of their extreme volatility caused by the pandemic. The triple lock was only suspended. It will come back, and this year inflation is running at a much higher level. And so that will be the key factor in setting pensions. But 2020 and 2021, the earnings were distorted very extremely and very unusually. And I think that was a completely reasonable approach to take.
Now, we just have time for one final pair of questions. The gentleman here has been extremely patient, so we'll go for him. And then the gentleman in the middle on this side, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've got you.
You got me? Yeah, thank you. Roy Ashman, Broadbent Conservatives in Norfolk. Jacob, you said early on the use of language is exceptionally important in everything we do, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think it's very important. And you also said that if we concede ground to woke language, then we almost actually accept the fact that that is the norm, and it's very difficult to get that back. In terms of education, socialist views and values and language are very much a hotbed, and they're very much alive and well within state education. How, as a government, do we address that, and how do we take that forward with the LEAs, and in fact, how do we almost reprimand them in making sure that there's a balance of view between left and right wing?
And our final question.
Thank you. Richard Hosking from South Devon. Jacob, whilst I share your enthusiasm for international trade, do you not feel that the events in Ukraine in the last fortnight have actually underlined the necessity to intervene when necessary to ensure the supply of strategic goods in defence, energy and food?
Thank you both for those questions.
Thank you very much. On the education of children, and I've got lots of children who are all being educated, it's absolutely fascinating. Children are not perhaps quite as susceptible to indoctrination as you may think. I mean, they're not mine particularly, but no, I'm actually thinking more of the, I'm not accusing any of their schools, either of their schools, of trying to indoctrinate them. They're not, but they do get taught the normal politesse of the chattering classes, yeah? And they come home and they tell me this is all ridiculous and this is what they've been told, and isn't it very funny? Maybe perhaps because we're quite a political household, but I think they're quite a political household, maybe an element of understatement. I probably don't have any other topic of conversation, but leaving that to one side, I think it is in the nature of the young to challenge what they're told by the old, and that therefore efforts to try and mould children are not quite as successful as intended, and that generations change and shift. And if I think back to my time at university, which was just at the end of Margaret Thatcher's period, she was replaced by John Major whilst I was up at Oxford, or from here down at Oxford, I suppose, that a lot of the people then who were great sort of left-wing warriors are now probably Conservative MPs. And that people change and they challenge, and so I wouldn't worry too much. You may think that's a bit complacent. And then to come on to the last question. What was the last question?
Strategic goods.
Oh,
energy,
strategic goods, yes,
defence
yes.
and food.
Well, there was a very strange view, which I think we are now leaving, that it was better to import hydrocarbons than to use our own resources. I could never understand that. Why is it greener to have oil from Saudi Arabia rather than from just beyond the Shetland Islands? That was a bonkers view. I think it's still the view of the Scottish government. Oh, it's a bonkers view, and the view of the Scottish government. Do you think that was a tautology? No, leaving that one aside. That we should obviously use our own resources, and we want to produce our own food. That's what farmers are there for. And we want to make it easier for them to produce their own food. That's why I'm pleased about the gene editing change in the law, because we want our farmers to be competitive with the rest of the world, because they are very, very good farmers. I mean, in our part of the world, we have some of the best conditions in Somerset, Devon, and Cornwall for dairy farming. And we want to allow our dairy farmers to be effective and competitive. Of course we do. And provide as much of our own as we economically can. We are never going to get back to self-sufficiency in food. We haven't been self-sufficient in food since the middle of the, probably early part of the 19th century. So that wouldn't be a sensible objective, but to use the resources we've got to the maximum capability is clearly sensible. And then there are other things that we need to think about where the free world may need to cooperate, because we don't want to be dependent on non-free states for the provision of essential raw materials, particularly when those non-free states may follow anti-competitive practices. And so working with the Australians particularly, because they have considerable raw materials, to ensure that essential resources that may have become economic because of anti-competitive practices are produced is something that it's certainly important to think about.
Does that include reliance on Saudi Arabia for oil?
Well, we can't not be reliant on Saudi Arabia for oil. But we found, I mean, look, why did the North Sea develop? Why did it become cost-effective to do the deep sea drilling? It became cost-effective to do the deep sea drilling because OPEC put the prices up so much in the early 1970s. We learned to our cost that being dependent on an individual nation or small group of nations was very risky. You always need variety in your supply chain, but Saudi Arabia is an important ally, which in these difficult circumstances can help us.
Thank you. Jacob, you've been extremely generous with your time to the extent we've actually overrun by a couple of minutes. It falls to me to say a few thank yous. Firstly, to Thorncliffe for kindly sponsoring this and making it possible. Secondly, of course, to you for being so kind with your time and insights in this very special episode of the Moggcast. Thank you to my colleagues at Conservative Home for organising this wonderful venue. And to all of you here, standing room only in the room. I know a lot of people watching on YouTube, people listening on iTunes, and so on. I hope you'll all join us in person in Blackpool or back on our YouTube channel at 11:30 for In Conversation with Anne-Marie Trevelyan. But last of all, please join me in a great round of applause for our guest.
Thank you very much.